Hello again. You're listening to the Photography Made Simple podcast with me, your host, Audrey-Anne, founder of Live Snap Love, where I teach you how to master your camera so that you can get images that you love and can't wait to share. Now, today we are going to be talking about the types of metering modes on your camera, what each one does, and how to choose the right one for the job. Because the metering mode that you use is actually incredibly important, because this determines how your camera looks at the scene and then decides what exposure reading to give you so that you can get an image that is perfectly exposed. In other words, not too dark and not too light. However, with so many different types of metering modes available, I get that it can be challenging to know which one to use in different situations. Now, most cameras today will have at least 3 in-camera metering modes. Now, these are called evaluative. That's if you use Canon. The same thing is called matrix metering on a Nikon, spot metering, and center weighted. So those are the main 3, evaluative, which is also called matrix metering, spot metering, and center weighted. Now, some will have others, such as partial metering or highlight weighted metering. Now, these are a bit less common, but we will cover them all today on the podcast. Now, before we dive into what each one does, I want to rewind a little bit and talk about what metering actually is so you can understand exactly why choosing the right metering mode is crucial. So metering is simply how our camera assesses the amount of light in the scene so that it can set the correct exposure, or if you shoot in manual mode, tell you where the correct exposure is. Now, if you shoot in full auto mode, then the in-camera metering system looks at the amount of light in the scene and then combines the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO values to give you the correct exposure. In theory, at least. If you shoot in any of the semi-automatic modes, such as aperture priority, again, the metering system looks at the amount of light in the scene, and then it takes whatever setting you have done, for example, aperture, and then balances out the exposure to meet its meter reading by choosing the correct shutter speed and ISO. And if you shoot in manual mode, you will still use your in-camera meter, but this time to assess the exposure, and then you will determine the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO yourself to get that meter where we want it. So whatever mode you shoot in, from auto mode to full manual mode, knowing how the various metering modes work will help you get your exposure right, without having to continually look at your preview scene and add or subtract exposure until you get it right. Now, as a quick little side note, just while I remember, you can't change the metering mode when you use full auto mode, which is yet another reason to start to move away from auto if you haven't already. Now, as we said at the beginning, there are several different types of metering available, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. So let's have a closer look now at those 5 types of metering modes I mentioned. And we're going to start by looking at evaluative, which is called matrix metering on a Nikon. So matrix metering is the default setting on most cameras. This mode divides the scene into multiple zones and then combines the reading from each zone to calculate the final exposure. It's a bit like auto for metering. It's simply taking a reading from every single part of the scene and then kind of puts it together and then tries to give you a middle ground exposure. But just as when shooting in auto mode, the camera will also frequently get the exposure wrong in this mode. In tricky light or any situation where the light isn't consistent and even, you aren't likely to get the correct exposure in this mode, since not all scenes are going to even out to that middle ground. For example, if you had a really bright light behind your subject, say you're shooting into the sky, then the camera will pretty much always end up giving you an underexposed subject because it tries to dampen down all that bright light, which is not what we want. Remember, your camera is just a piece of equipment and it cannot see and read the light in the same way that we do. So all it can do is make an educated guess And in this situation, it's no wonder it gets it wrong. It's seeing lots of bright light, so it tries to dampen it down. It doesn't understand that maybe in that example, your subject's only taking up a small area of the frame. So although matrix metering can be a good all-rounder and is probably the easiest to use, especially if you are just starting out, it really doesn't give you the control that you need in all situations. So let's move on to the next type of metering mode, and that is center weighted. And that's called the same thing whether you shoot in Canon or Nikon. Now in this mode, the camera still takes information from the whole frame, just as it did with matrix metering. However, this time it gives a lot more weight or consideration to the information there in the center of the frame. Now, if you do want to see examples of images where I'm showing you the areas that the camera is metering from in these different modes, be sure to head over to the blog post that accompanies this episode. If you are listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, just scroll down and you will see a link to the website and you'll be able to get more information there and see some example photos as well. So if you like a little bit of a visual prompt as well, make sure you go over to the website. That's livesnaplove.com, but I will link to it around where you're listening to this podcast. Okay, so back to center weighted. Now, essentially, in this mode, the camera is assuming that the subject is slap bang in the center of the frame. So it's giving more consideration to that area because it's guessing that that's where your subject is. Now, it is probably easier to predict how the camera will react using this metering mode rather than matrix metering. But the area it meters for is still pretty large. So whilst it will give a better result in some situations, usually portraits or when you have a good even mix of tones throughout the frame, it's not the ideal mode. And this is also because for many photos that we take, guess what? We don't have our subjects positioned directly in the center of the frame. In fact, for many, if we want images that look a bit more dynamic, we're going to move our subject to the side. So this means it will give you an incorrect meter reading for what you're actually trying to photograph. It's also still not the best mode for scenes that has a lot of contrast or uneven lighting. Now let's move on to the final one of the main 3 metering modes, and this is spot metering. And again, it's called the same using Canon or Nikon. Now spot metering does exactly what you would expect it to from the name. It tells the camera to meter from a very small specific spot of the frame rather than the whole scene, or as it comes to center weighted, giving more consideration to a certain area, but still quite a large area of the frame. So instead of judging exposure based on the entire scene and then trying to balance it out to get that middle ground, it just focuses its metering on a very small area. So this very small spot in the frame, it's actually around 3 to 5% of the frame. And again, if you do want to see an example of that, you can go over to the blog post for this podcast episode and you'll see some examples there. Now, this mode is particularly useful when you want to ensure that a particular area of the image is properly exposed, such as a person's face or a bright object in an otherwise dark scene. By using a really small area of the scene to meter from, this helps give the camera more information or the correct information, and that will help get you the correct exposure because you're telling the camera exactly the area that you need to expose for. For that reason, it's the most precise and therefore gives you the most control over the exposure of your image. And because the metering is more accurate from the start, you'll have less chimping and adjusting, and you'll get the correct exposure straight from the get-go. Okay, so that was the 3 main metering modes. That was evaluative, which is called that if you use Canon, or matrix metering if you use Nikon, center weighted, and spot. But there is a couple of others that you might have. In some camera models, you may also have a partial metering mode, Or you may have this, but not spot metering. Now, this works in a very similar way to spot metering, but the area of the scene it meters from is larger, around 10 to 15%. So if you don't have spot metering, you can use this instead, as it works in the same way. Now, in some Nikon cameras, you may also have highlight weighted metering. Now, in this mode, the camera gathers information from the whole of the scene, just as it does with matrix metering, but instead it gives greater consideration for the highlights in the image. In other words, this metering mode tries to save the highlights and make sure that you don't clip them. So this could be useful in situations where the highlights are the most important element in the frame, and maybe you don't have the time or the inclination to use spot metering. So which metering mode should you use? Well, when you are starting out, you will want to stick with matrix or evaluative metering. It's a good all-rounder, and in evenly lit scenes, it will work reasonably well. However, when you get more experience and indeed start experimenting with more challenging light, you will find it easier to move on to spot metering, as this gives you a more accurate reading and will therefore help you get your settings right quickly. Now, this will be more difficult to use to begin with, for sure, but just until you get the hang of it. And then the upside is that once you understand how to use it on different subjects, you won't need to make any big exposure changes. So it can be quicker to get your exposure right first time. Now, one major caveat here, you do need to be shooting in manual mode to use spot metering. Trying to use spot metering with aperture priority mode will literally drive you up the wall, because your exposure will keep changing every 10 seconds. So don't say I didn't warn you. If you are still on any of the semi-automatic modes, just stick with evaluative. So metering for exposure and indeed shooting in manual mode is something that we go over in depth in my Auto to Awesome program, because both are so important for getting your images to look the way that you want them to. But for now, here's a little guide as to when each mode is useful. And as a little side note, you might also want to download my free manual settings cheat sheet. This will help you know exactly what settings you should be using when. So I will link to that and to Auto to Awesome in the show notes for this episode. Again, you will find a link to it around where you're listening to this podcast. Just scroll down and you'll find the notes for the episode, and all the links are there. Okay, so when should you use matrix or evaluative metering? So any scenes that are evenly lit and there's no big difference in tones throughout the scene, then matrix and evaluative will work well. It can also be good when using flash. And sometimes with macro photography as well, although sometimes other modes will work better, but generally it's taking up quite a large area of the scene. So in most cases, that's good for macro photography as well. For center weighted metering mode, this is any time that the subject is in the center of the frame and takes up the majority of the center of the frame, such as a classic portrait headshot. And spot metering is best for any time when the scene is not evenly lit, such as backlit images, when you want to take a silhouette photo, snowy scenes, dark scenes, concerts, stage performances, any scenes where your subject is not the largest element in the frame, any scene where there is high contrast. All of those are best taken using spot metering mode. Now, partial metering, I would use that if you don't have spot metering available. And highlight weighted metering, you can use that for concerts or other stage performances where you have really bright highlights surrounded by darkness. It should work well there. Or any other times when spot metering is unavailable or simply not the best option, and the highlights are the most important element in the frame. So you can see that spot metering is the most useful in the majority of situations, which is why it's the one I use most often and I pretty much never move out of, and the one that I recommend you learn how to use along with shooting in manual mode. Now, don't forget, I have some extra resources for you, including that camera settings cheat sheet, over on our website, livesnaplove.com. This is where we've got loads more resources for you for learning photography, mastering your camera, editing, light, composition, everything you need to know in order to get photos that you absolutely love, can't wait to share, and that your friends can't stop raving about. So do swipe up from where you are listening to this podcast and you will get links to everything that I've mentioned here. So thanks so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you being here and for listening to this podcast. And if you have a question you would like me to answer or a topic that you'd like me to cover, then get in touch. Again, I'll leave a link to it around where you're listening to the podcast. Get in touch, fill out the form, let me know what you'd like to hear, and I will add it into my content calendar. All right, thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. Bye for now.